Hello and welcome to More Than a Game. It's myself, Patric, and we've got a fascinating interview to bring you today. I'm joined by business writer John Blain, and we're speaking today to Samuel Cuthbert, who is a barrister for Outer Temple Chambers. He is a specialist in sports law and commercial law, and he's kindly agreed to speak to us today regarding the Premier League profit and sustainability regulations, Everton's case that has just been heard for the 21-22 cycle, the case that is going to be heard this month for Everton's second charge, and Nottingham Forest charge on essentially what this means for the Premier League moving forward, what this means for football financial regulation moving forward as well. Samuel, first of all, thanks very much for joining us. Can you just give us a brief background for yourself and your specialisms within sports law and your experience in the field?
Sure. Yeah. Well, look, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on. So as you say, I'm a junior sports law barrister. I've got particular interests in the overlap between the commercial and regulatory side of sport, and that inevitably means that I find the FFP and the PSR work, which is emerging, to be particularly fascinating. And I think with that in mind, that's probably why you've invited me on the podcast today.
Yeah, I've seen you've obviously done some pieces with other publications, and you're obviously always sharing reports and your thoughts on those reports. So it's going to be fascinating to dive into that today. And I thought we'd get started. Then we'll jump straight in. Obviously, we're looking at this from football journalists, football reporters, fans' point of view as well. And when you're reading through these reports and trying to get your head around legal jargon, it can all be very confusing. So I'd just like to start with the legal base essentially for the points deduction that Everton were handed in their first case. That seemed to come from in the initial hearing, at least, came from case law of VFL cases that had gone by. They kind of leaned heavily on that, and then the appeals report, the appeals panel report, did almost dive into that in a bit more detail. So I just want to get your thoughts on how that came about. Really, is it just because of case law, or is there really any legal basis either for it? From that standpoint, because there has been a bit of confusion on how points deductions must be inferred, sporting advantage must be inferred.
Yeah, okay. Well, there are probably a few things to break down there. I think the first thing to say is that the appeal board the decision is going to be a useful decision going forward, not least with the future Everton case in mind, with the Nottingham Forest case in mind, because what it effectively does is it prescribes a tariff for determining sanction in cases of PSR breach in the Premier League. And it's interesting because the Premier League handbook doesn't provide a tariff. And so the tariff that we get from the appeal board decision is effectively grounded in the EFL guidelines, and indeed also in the EFL jurisprudence. So if you've read the judgment, for instance, there's reference in the appeal board decision to the Sheffield Wednesday breach, where the club in that case exceeded the EFL upper loss threshold by just over 46% or 46.7%, I think it was, as well as a focus on the trend in the EFL rules as well. And it's interesting because the Premier League, at first instance, so this was when it was heard by the Commission, made what was then called the structured sanctions submission, which was subsequently rejected as being inconsistent with the unrestricted powers which have been conferred on the Commission. The reason I say that it's interesting is because we then have a situation on the one hand where the Premier League could enforce this kind of mandatory structured formula for dealing with PSR breaches, and they could do that by way of amending their regulations. But the appeal board even say this much in their decision. The legislative ball remains in the Premier League's court. On the other hand, in seeking to kind of affect some similar regulations by way of the structured sanctions submission, and that then being rejected, what we now have is a tariff from the appeal board which is much more closely aligned with the EFL rules. So it's a super, from a regulatory perspective, it's a really interesting development. As far as how it's going to go to impact the next Everton case, which I think is probably something you're particularly concerned about, I think the appeal board agreed with the commission, so that's when it was heard at first instance, that the main reason for the club's breach was that it didn't manage its finances as prudently as it might well have done. And you'd have heard, I imagine, in the press, a number of references to the double jeopardy argument. It's been done to death, really. But as a result, we all know that there are overlaps between the two sets of alleged breaches. And in that case, it's not difficult for us to conceive of the financial imprudence, which I mentioned a moment ago, being a kind of further vulnerability for Everton in the next case.
I mean, Sam, that's interesting. Can I just, for me anyway, and hopefully for some of the people who may watch or listen to this, because what you rightly said was that the chair of the first independent commission, which Everton faced, said it was not his job to determine how you calculate the punishment, even though, as you rightly said, or implied, he seemed to, although he did dismiss the submission from the Premier League chief exec, he did come up with an answer which was very similar to what he said, which was then contradicted by the appeal board. But it does appear, though, that we've found ourselves in a situation where the second KC, that is the chair of the appeal board, was more open, as you said, to laying down case examples of how you calculate what a tariff should be. But for me, it goes a bit further than that, because, and hopefully you can tell me whether you agree or not, that it seems now that it's pretty much established, despite the lack of evidence to support it, that a breach of this regulation does give a football club sporting advantage, and therefore they should get a sporting punishment. That sporting punishment pretty much is, despite the far-reaching levers, if you will, that are available to these commissions, but they've narrowed it right down to being a points deduction, and more than that, an immediate points deduction. So are we really saying that when independent commissions or indeed appeals occur, the real life world we're going to go into is just with barristers and KCs and the like arguing about what the value is of the points deduction, rather whether the points deduction itself is appropriate or not?
So it's a great question. So one of the grounds of Everton's appeal which was unsuccessful, related to sporting advantage. The point which was advanced by the club, in part to support its argument that there shouldn't be a sporting sanction by way of points deduction, because they were saying that breach of the PSR threshold shouldn't be assumed to result in a sporting advantage. And the ground of appeal was effectively that the commission had made a fundamental error in proceeding on the premise that within the PSR there is a target of a nil PSR loss, and that a sporting advantage can be inferred from any loss over £105 million. Now, that was rejected by the appeal board. And it's a difficult argument for Everton to make, because there's an obvious correlation between a club spending on players and improvement on the pitch, and hence in the placing in the league, right? So we do get a general proposition from the appeal board decision, albeit not an irrebuttable proposition, and that's key, from the decision, which is that where there is a breach of the PSR, a sporting advantage will generally be inferred, and where there is a sporting advantage inferred, that a sporting sanction will be appropriate. As to whether or not the points deduction or an immediate points deduction will be the only appropriate sanction, I think the appeal board was pretty clear on this.
It was, yeah.
It emphasises the point that any breach of, well, it's rule E51.
That's right, yeah.
This is effectively any PSR calculation which shows loss over 105 million for the relevant period. So any breach of E51 warrants a points deduction, and that nothing less than a points deduction is going to be appropriate. Now, the reasoning given for that is that only a points deduction with immediate and overt effect has the appropriate disincentive power for clubs to remain within the upper threshold required to maintain the aim of the financial fair play regime. And so I think we do have a set of useful guidelines, and I think it will start to be quite difficult to escape from the guidelines which have been set out in the appeal board judgment. But as I say, the presumption on sporting advantage is not irrebuttable.
Well, that would be entertaining to see how it is attempted to be rebutted or not, won't it? Because I think the key for me when I read the appeal board outcome was the use of the word immediate, and therefore Gary Hickenbottom put quite force into it needs to be immediate. Therefore, ultimately that means a fine, I guess, or a points deduction, and a fine wouldn't have an immediate impact, therefore points deduction. The other reading of the outcome of the appeal board that I had, and I know some people have read it slightly differently, was I have concluded, therefore, that the minimum points deduction that both Everton and Nottingham Forest can expect is 3. And that the maximum is 9 because of the claim that it shouldn't be a points deduction for a breach of the upper threshold is less dangerous to a football club than insolvency. Therefore, as the insolvency rule is 9 points immediately, what we're looking at here is a potential tariff that's somewhere between 3 and 9. Does that sound right to you?
I think that's fairly persuasive. Now, of course, the benchmarks which have been set down in this decision will be persuasive, albeit not necessarily binding in circumstances where another appeal board is presented with an appeal in different factual circumstances. But I think broadly, I can see the force in the 3 to 9 bracket that you've provided. The 9-point figure, for reference, comes from the automatic 9-point deduction, which is applied when a given club suffers what's called an event of insolvency, i.e. it goes into insolvency. And that was a key benchmark for determining Everton's reduction in sanction on appeal, because the comparator was really that the 10-point deduction was internally inconsistent with the framework of the Premier League rules. And so I think there are some very strong logical reasons for that 9-point upper limit being placed, and I would think that the 3 to 9 bracket that you just provided for will be a fairly reasonable and a fairly consistent bracket that's used going forwards.
I think that would be good, and the word consistent I think is helpful, because one of my observations would be with the literal freedom for a independent commission or indeed an appeal board to actually hand down any sanction that they wish, up to and including expulsion from the league, which is quite crazy, but there you go. How are we going to get some degree of consistency? And I think that's where Gary Hickenbottom has helped a lot, I think, because you've just summarised it really well. Most clubs now should expect that if you get called for a breach of the upper threshold, you are going to suffer an immediate points deduction, and it's going to be in a range of 3 to 9. And don't bother arguing that you shouldn't get a points deduction per se, because you're going to find yourself on really flaky ground.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing that lawyers are always striving towards is certainty. And I think that the appeal board decision does start to give you some certainty, albeit, as I said before, the presumption as far as sporting advantage goes is not irrebuttable. So there are still arguments to be had, but certainty, as I say, is a good thing.
But the Everton KC in the appeal chose not to challenge what is becoming almost an anchor point of a points deduction comes from a sporting advantage, which comes from a breach of the upper threshold. And I probably need to let Pat join in this at some stage. But we on this channel, more than a game, we're very interested in not just what happens to Everton, but also what happens to Nottingham Forest. Mm-hmm. And of course, Nottingham Forest, as we speak, are going through an independent commission. And they presumably will be seeking to offer some mitigation for their breach of the upper threshold. And they're also likely to argue that they sold their star player literally to try and comply with the regulation, but they did it outside of the reporting period. Is that going to get any traction for them, in your view?
Well, I think there's still an argument that Nottingham Forest's so this is a record sale of Brennan Johnson.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think there's still an argument that's going to be accepted as a mitigating, or should be accepted as a mitigating factor. So, I mean, for listeners, Johnson was sold to Tottenham for 50 million in August 2023, and as you rightly point out, was outside the financial accounting period in issue.
Yeah.
And there was also an offer for him from Brentford, I think, in June for 30 million, which was rejected. I imagine what the argument will be here is that Forest will point to the fact that they sold Johnson, and that sale brought them back into compliance with the PSR rules. Now, I've not seen the accounts. I don't know if that's true, but that, I imagine, would be the argument. And therefore, the argument would then likely be that they've removed any sporting advantage by selling him. And then, as we mentioned before, it's still then open to argue that that no sporting advantage flows from the specific PSR breach.
Just on that point, Samuel, sorry, just to intervene, because that's what the read that I got from the ideas of the reports, obviously from the Forest side. Could the potential, and you may have been coming on to this anyway, the potential fall down of that issue being that Forest actually played Brennan Johnson in 3 matches in August 2023 before selling him. And in one of those matches, they beat Sheffield United. He played 91 minutes. I think he was subbed off in stoppage time. In the other 2 that he played, they lost, one to Manchester United, one to Arsenal. Could there actually be a quantifiable sporting advantage there that Brennan Johnson was played in 3 games and Nottingham Forest picked up 3 points? It's that, because obviously in the Everton case, the whole thing was sporting advantage, and both Appeal Board and the Independent Commission did say it's not quantifiable. Whereas perhaps here, is there, from a legal perspective at least, is that something that's quantifiable if the Johnson argument were to fail from Nottingham Forest perspective?
I don't think it's ever really going to be a kind of a perfect counsel. You're never going to have a perfect mathematical calculation of sporting advantage. It's one thing to find that there is a sporting advantage, and that must necessarily be the case in circumstances where a club has spent more money than is permissible, some of which will be on players. And to my mind, it would be a lot more concerning if the Appeal Board undertook to precisely assess, what advantage that's brought, because it's effectively it's an impossible task with too many variables. You'd be assessing things like form of players, I suppose, injuries, how teams have clicked, gelled with the addition of new players, all of these things which are unaccessible, really. They are unquantifiable in mathematical terms. So it's an impossible task to quantify, but that shouldn't mean that there isn't a sporting advantage, and it's that sporting advantage which needs to be sanctioned. So just because you can't precisely say what it is doesn't mean you shouldn't be liable for the sanction. And I think let's not also forget that the dual purpose of the sanction is disincentive from breach of the PSR as well. So it has to weigh that into consideration too.
How comfortable are you, Sam, that the alleged reason for having these rules is to protect the integrity of the competition and specifically to avoid football clubs going out of business? And yet most of what we're talking about is actually balancing the outcome of the competition by some very subjective view that if you breach an upper threshold, you've had an advantage which by definition is perceived to be unfair, whilst other clubs are never going to breach that because their period of unfairness, if you like, was before these rules were invented.
Well, I think there are 2 things. The first is to go back to the fact that there isn't. It's not assumed. Well, it's not objective to say there is a sporting advantage. There is an argument to be had as to whether a given breach of the PSR results in a sporting advantage, and so that's always going to be up for grabs. It's not irrebuttable. And the second point, I think, is to say that ultimately these rules do need policing, and they were initially brought in with in mind protecting clubs, protecting clubs as cultural institutions for fans, ensuring the integrity of competition. And the rules are only as good as the enforcement mechanisms in place to ensure that they are adhered to. It feels as though we're going through something of a teething process. It feels as though what we are currently suffering through is a kind of the result of some uncertainty as to correct tariffs, as to how sanctions should be in place. And I would hope, albeit there may be changes from a kind of legislative perspective at the PR, I would hope that this teething period that we're going through does result in some further certainty, and that by the time we get to a couple of years down the line, we aren't necessarily dealing with
I think they're wise words, and I think Gary Hickenbottom, I think, tried to apply some common sense to his judgment, which I think is rightly helpful. And you talked about he's in the foothills, my words, not yours, the foothills of applying some case-based consistency. But I can't help but avoid that, a personal view, that much of this still hangs in and around a word called subjective. Gary himself said, I don't want to get into a forensic analysis of whether someone's over by 19.7% or 20.3%, because the principle is if you breach, and the further you breach or go past the 105 gain line, if you will, the bigger the punishment should be, notwithstanding there's a ceiling at 9 points, yeah? But are we not just going to end up with lawyers and barristers and the like arguing mitigation at a time when, and I agree with you, by the way, that these rules have been in place for 10 years. They've not been exposed to scrutiny. They've not been tested per se. And they're suffering a little bit from being stress tested in the public eye. But everybody knows Everton and Nottingham Forest may be the only clubs who get sanctioned using these rules, because they're going to change them again. How do you protect the integrity of the sport and the regulatory environment? And I don't want to go on the independent regulator route when you're changing the rules mid-season, as Leicester have exploited in the challenges that they have, and then everybody knows you're going to change them again, and the outcome could very well be for Everton or Nottingham Forest that the consequences of these failures, because they give a double whammy of points deductions, which may lead to relegation, which may lead to financial difficulties, they could actually cause to happen what they're there to stop from happening. Bit long-winded, but hopefully you kept up with me. Sorry.
I think the question that you're really asking is a very difficult one to answer, and that is that how do you guarantee the integrity of competition in the Premier League in circumstances where there is an awful lot of money, and it's a very difficult thing to answer, not least evident through the fact that the Premier League, I think, don't necessarily have the perfect system in place currently. I think the thing we need to fall back on is that there has to be some sort of regulation in the way that clubs spend money.
I agree, yeah,
and not least to protect the fans. For instance, what happened with Bury, that was a really sad, very, very moving thing for the club and the fans. And there needs to be systems in place to ensure that doesn't happen. They are important cultural institutions. And so if we're starting on the basis that you need some sort of regulation in place, that's a positive thing. Now, it may be that those regulations become a kind of movable feast, and they have to adapt and develop to
evolve.
Meet the various challenges. I don't necessarily think that additional legislative changes to simplify the rules would be a bad thing. As you say, it may be that there is some sort of dead weight as to whether clubs are able to exploit changes in new legislative developments, with the PL bringing in new regulations. Ultimately, what we're striving for, though, as you say, is integrity in the sport, and the best way to do that is with an effective regulatory framework. There has to be within that the ability to bring prosecutions for breaches of those regulations and the ability to sanction accordingly. And so, whilst there is a lot of doom and gloom around, I think there are also some positives to take from it, which is that, as you mentioned earlier, that we are starting to get slightly more consistency in the decisions. That there is more of a logical basis to the sanctions which are being dealt out, and to that extent, the regulations are starting to take hold in the way that they were intended.
I think that's really good, and I think the appeal board helped in that state because of the approach that the chair took, and of course Everton at the end of that, announced that they were satisfied with the outcome. I don't think they necessarily were satisfied with the size of the deduction from 10 points, but they clearly had a bit more respect for the process than they did the first time around, maybe. We touched briefly on the mitigation, which you think may have some traction for Nottingham Forest. And I know Pat has a query around what mitigation Everton may be able to use. So he throws that in your lap. Let's see how you deal with that one.
From that, there was in the initial case for Everton, they only used the the sanctions on Alisher Usmanov, essentially saying that to the stadium naming rights deal that Everton claim was in the works, being signed. The appeal board actually went into more detail of that in their judgment and said, well, we believe, or we were told, or we have seen that some legal documents were in place in January 2022, but they were never signed essentially by Farmashiri. So we can't give you mitigation. We can't allow mitigation for something that isn't there, which I personally think is absolutely fine. I view that as fair enough. Like, you can't claim that things would have happened just because you say they were going to happen if you've got no proof to back it up, or you've got no signature on a dotted line. But in these latest set of accounts that Everton are in, the Everton have been charged for 22-23, and other clubs are obviously Nottingham Forest, Leicester possibly even facing issues. Everton may have lost in those accounts sponsorship deals with USM, Yotta, and Megaphone, who were the three Russian companies, or the three Usmanov-owned companies, I should say. Do you think that possibly, from your knowledge of the case, there might be a path there that Everton could use? Because there's been varying reports, but there's possibly up to 20, maybe even 30 million there in lost revenue over, that has come into place last season. Do you think that might be something Everton can put forward as reasonable mitigation this time, given the unforeseen circumstances of the Ukraine war?
I think that there may well be something in that. What effectively the argument would be that there's a loss of chance flowing from the fact of mounting political pressure to dissociate with those companies. Albeit I don't think, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, I don't think that those companies were sanctioned.
I believe, and even at the time, I think it was I think Everton took a moral decision maybe to cut ties, which I think is probably the right decision to make. Sanctions came around the same time, yeah.
So if you've got a sanction that you can hook the loss of chance argument on, then that's certainly a stronger position for Everton to take. But it sounds as though that isn't the case, and it would be, as you rightly point out, more of a moral argument. There is mounting political pressure to dissociate with companies, and to that extent, we say that there is, a loss of chance. It wouldn't have been moral for us to carry on dealing with them, and that any financial losses flowing from that should be taken into account in mitigation when looking at PSR breaches. I think there is a stronger, there is an argument there certainly, and it doesn't fall foul of the same vulnerability that the Everton, the first case did, which is that there wasn't a signed contract at the point of the incursion into Ukraine, and so evidently the situation is probably stronger, albeit the weakness would be that without a specific sanction to hang the loss of chance argument on, it may be slightly harder to demonstrate that political pressure, mounting political pressure, was sufficient to give rise to the loss of chance.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I've got what is for me the last question from me, Sam, if you'd be so kind.
Of course.
I think for the good of football, these sorts of things playing out on a regular basis, and clearly as Pat's called out, Leicester City have got some challenges. We know that Aston Villa think they've got to sell players to comply and so on. Newcastle are very frustrated and the like. For the good of football, we need an outcome from what's going on with Nottingham Forest and Everton now as soon as possible. And it seems to me that both those clubs will suffer a points deduction immediately this season, and that will have an impact on the relegation fights, I guess. But going back to the query about consistency, for me, it's also important that if either of those clubs have breached the upper threshold by significantly more than the other one, they should end up with a bigger punishment. But do these ICs operate independently of each other? I know we can put them in series, and therefore the Everton judge may know what the outcome was of the Nottingham Forest case, but he may not know the outcome of any subsequent appeal. And the metric I've put down for this is it possible for the regulatory environment here to get to a point where both Everton and Forest are sufficiently satisfied with the process and what's happened that they choose not to appeal? Because if we can get to a place where both of them do not appeal, I think that would be a really good place. And I wondered what your thoughts were.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what you're effectively asking, can we have a regulatory framework that the clubs are sufficiently satisfied with, that they don't feel the need to appeal every decision that comes against them?
Yes,
is that
absolutely.
I certainly think that's the goal. Nobody wants to be in a situation where there is a kind of constant uncertainty raised by the prospect of an appeal. And the other thing to note here is that the Premier League brings these cases against the clubs in question. And akin to any other sort of litigation, there's always scope to have without prejudice discussions too.
Excellent.
And it remains within the gift of the Premier League to make provision for sanctions to be applied between seasons, for instance, if that's something that may satisfy the clubs. Whether or not they want to do that's another thing. As things stand, I think the appeal board decision as to kind of immediate points deductions, they follow a logic which is quite hard to break. Which
I
is
agree.
Effectively, in order to quell sporting advantage, the sanction needs to be immediate. I think the more interesting question is really a matter of practicality, which is really if it takes months to bring the cases and the sanctions are handed down after a team has been, say, relegated in that time, or perhaps even in the case of Leicester City, promoted. I'm from Leicester. Full disclosure, hoping for promotion. The question then becomes, well, does it not become impossible to impose a kind of proportionate points deduction to the previous season's results? That the uncertainty that creates is really undesirable, and it's really the same point about what happens to Man City's trophies if they're dot points in the years that they're charged with the FFP breaches. But the answer, I think, is a major headache for clubs and the league, and it's certainly one I would imagine that they try to agree between them. And any appeal is only going to add to that headache. So I would hope that there is a system that we can find where there isn't necessarily a kind of an assumption that every decision goes to appeal. And I would hope that some of these things can be dealt with without necessarily having to litigate them.
That sounds like a very balanced answer from a barrister to me, but I think yes, I think that should give some it gives comfort to me that the potential for without prejudice discussions, let's just say behind the scenes, taking place to make sure that the outcomes are consistent and relative to each other. Therefore, both Forest and Everton think, you know what, on the balance of what we've done wrong, that sounds about right. So let's put it behind us and both avoid relegation if that's possible.
Yeah,
and I think, and you touched on it at the end. My final question for me, Samuel, is you mentioned there that word litigation that has been thrown around. It's an easy headline grabber, isn't it? That clubs are going to sue each other. I know it's not quite like that. It's more that they will go to an independent commission who can then decide on compensation amounts. And obviously, the first independent commission in May 2023, May the 9th, 2023, did hold a hearing with the Premier League, with Everton, and then 5 applicant clubs, one of those being Leicester City, one of those being Nottingham Forest, Leeds, Southampton and Burnley were also involved. Now, those applicant clubs, their application to be involved in the Premier League's case against Everton was rejected, but David Phillips, the KC at the time, did say if Everton are found guilty, you may be able to seek compensation. Now, there's a bit of confusion from my point of view, is they were given a 20-day period of notice, essentially, after the initial decision to make those compensation claims. Now, there's nothing in the public domain that they necessarily definitely did do that, but would that be in the public domain anyway? Has the appeal hearing have impacted that? Would they have had to wait on the outcome of an appeal before putting their claims in, or would they have had to do it before in that 20?
Yeah, it's slightly curious. In circumstances where they were bringing a claim for, say, any financial losses that they may have incurred, and they were doing that through the kind of typical court proceedings, which is what we call Part 7 proceedings in the High Court, there wouldn't be necessarily any reason that those proceedings would be bound by a time period provided for in the regulatory proceedings. If, on the other hand, they were looking to bring the matter as an arbitration, I can see that there may be more truck with the argument that a limitation provided on the regulatory side should be adhered to. I should say I'm not currently involved in those proceedings, so it's hard for me to give you an answer when those decisions really turn on discussions which clubs will be having behind closed doors. Of course, back in November, it was what you're talking about was the Burnley, Leicester, and Leeds case, and a couple of others, Southampton, wasn't it? They were
Forest.
going to Forest, yeah, and the reports then emerged in December about a potential settlement. I wouldn't be surprised if what we start to see is a general trend towards settlement in these matters for the certainty that it brings, particularly in circumstances where there are huge points deductions that potentially could be made, creating uncertainty elsewhere on the club's balance sheets, and litigation in circumstances where there is significant uncertainty elsewhere isn't necessarily something that they are going to be willing to undertake.
Yeah, and then just a bit of expansion on that for me. Obviously, we've seen, you mentioned Leicester earlier, and we've seen this week the reports about the fact that they could face potential PSR breach from the Premier League or potential charge as early as next week for a breach in the 2022-23 accounts, which I imagine they would be the ones, if they did have a case for litigation or compensation claim, that would also be the year that they were looking to claim on Everton's. Obviously, when Leicester went down last season, but it turns out they were in breach. It turns out Forest, who were part of that initial application, they've been charged with a breach. Just from a layman's perspective, it all seems very messy. That you've got clubs that are essentially all breaching, all looking for settlements from each other. It's like, just call it even, lads. You've all done something.
Undoubtedly, there is an awful lot to unpick, and as I touched on earlier, waiting for the decision, for the Man City decision, for instance, that those sorts of decisions are going to have quite profound impacts potentially on the historic record, various trophies, various league wins. How you start to unpick that, I think, is probably for somebody above my pay grade. It's an incredibly complex, very nuanced, and I would think quite a fraught process. And I'm quite glad that I don't find myself necessarily on the regulator side having to see a route through it.
Fantastic.
It is going to keep you busy, Sam, though, for the coming years. So
may well be, yeah.
Make hay while the sun shines, my friend. Make hay.
Well, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us, Samuel. I really appreciate it. It's been fascinating. It's been brilliant to get an actual expert's opinion on it, and that expert voice. I think many people who listen to this and our audience will be delighted with that. And we've covered it in detail as much as we can. John's done some fantastic articles over it on A More Than a Game as well. Please go and check those out. So thanks again for joining us, Samuel. I really appreciate your time. John, thanks for hopping on as well. It's been a fascinating call, and thank you very much.